Good afternoon, everyone, and on behalf of the L. Douglas Wilder School of Government and Public Affairs at VCU, welcome to the October installment of the Alumni Lunch and Learn series. Today's session is What's a Major Question? Changes in U.S. Supreme Court administrative law rulings and their impact on the federal bureaucracy, with our speakers, Dr. John Aughenbaugh and Dr. RaJade James. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, the Wilder School hosts free virtual events like this one monthly. Each session features change agents, thought leaders, and policymakers who provide insights and commentary on relevant topics of the day. My name is Stephen Dozier, and I am the Director of Alumni Engagement and Development here at the Wilder School. Before we start, let me share some announcements. We are excited to announce that we are rising in the rankings. The Wilder School is the #1 graduate program for public affairs in Virginia and is in the top 15% in the nation. We are number 35 among public affairs graduate schools and have the 29th ranked public management and leadership program. We are proud to be at the forefront of our field. I would also like to note, now is the time to register to attend the 2022 Gulag Lecture on Civic Art, Justice, and Inclusion with Christopher Howard next Thursday, October 27th. And this event is back in person for the first time since 2019. So please register for that. Our spring 2023 Wilder School program application deadlines are extended until December 1. Our most recent edition of the Wilder School in Action magazine is available online, so check it out by clicking on the live link on your screen. Join our Policy Bites newsletter for the latest news for policymakers. And see all the links that I've shared in this intro in the chat provided by my colleague, Rachel. And now I present our moderator, Senior Associate Dean and Professor, Dr. RaJade James, to introduce today's speaker. Dr. Barry James.
Thanks so much, Stephen. It is indeed my pleasure today to introduce to our audience Dr. John Aughenbaugh, who is an associate professor in the political science department at Virginia Commonwealth University in Richmond, Virginia. Dr. Aughenbaugh has taught at VCU since the fall of 2005, and before that, he taught political science courses and was an administrator at Virginia Tech University. Dr. Augie, as we come to love and refer to him, has earned his doctoral degree in public administration and policy and master's degree in political science from Virginia Tech. Dr. Augie teaches a wide array of American political science courses. Sorry about that. I'm just going to pick up where I left off. Hopefully I am still connected. Just never know these things. I'm just going to refer again that Dr. Augie teaches a wide array of American political science courses at VCU, including constitutional law, courts and politics, public administration and policy, administrative law, introduction to U.S. government, and politics in film. He has been nominated for and won a number of teaching awards and is frequently asked to comment and has presented lectures on various topics in American political science, especially administrative and constitutional law and the courts. Dr. Augie also records a podcast with VCU librarian Nia Rogers entitled Civil Discourse Regarding Government Docs and Political Phenomenon. It's my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker today and sit back and enjoy the lecture. It is certainly one that I'm looking forward to. Thank you so much, Dr. Augie. Nice to see you here today.
Thank you, Dean Barry James. And also, I want to extend my thanks to the Wilder School for this invitation. When I was approached in the summer, Dean Gooden asked me if I would be interested in talking about the impact of U.S. Supreme Court rulings from the most recent term. I think I may have surprised her a little bit when I decided to focus my attention on an administrative law ruling, which will be the focus of my discussion today. Next slide, please. So the focus of my remarks is a Supreme Court ruling from this past late spring, West Virginia versus EPA. And in the case, the Supreme Court invalidated the EPA's efforts to address climate change. And the way the court did so was through the use of what scholars refer to as the major questions doctrine. So what I'm going to do is first give a brief discussion of how the federal courts have reviewed administrative actions in the United States, and then discuss the major questions doctrine and what the U.S. Supreme Court using the major questions doctrine, what might that mean for administrative behavior, and what we might see in regards to various presidential administrations' policy initiatives going forward. Next slide, please. So first, I want to tell a story. And the story is, how have the U.S. federal courts responded to the rise of the administrative state in this country? And the story originates in the 1930s. So as the country was responding to the Great Depression, President Roosevelt comes into office, works with the United States Congress to create what many of us refer to as the New Deal. But many of these New Deal programs get challenged in the federal courts, some of which rise to the level of the U.S. Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court, in the Schechter-Poultry case from 1935, used what scholars refer to as the non-delegation doctrine in declaring major sections of the National Recovery Act unconstitutional. And what the court said in Schechter-Poultry in particular was that if the United States Congress was going to transfer meaningful legislative authority to the executive branch, it had to do so with guidelines to govern or shape how the agencies use that authority. So at least initially, it appeared as though the Supreme Court was going to be skeptical of the executive branch utilizing unfettered or unchecked authority to make regulations, enact broad sweeping policy change. But our next data point in the story is the passage of the Administrative Procedures Act in 1946. There, the Congress, as many public administration and policy students and scholars well know, in this law, Congress required a specific process known as notice and comment or informal rulemaking, a specific process to be used. But if agencies followed that process, the assumption, at least by the United States Congress, was they used the authority correctly. And federal courts followed suit. So we see, for instance, a roughly 20 to 25 year period of the federal courts showing quite a bit of deference to how federal agencies used authority given by the United States Congress, even if Congress did not give specific guidance or guidelines as called for in the Schechter-Poultry ruling. But this begins to change in the late 1960s and the first half of the 1970s. Spurred by some rulings by the DC Circuit Court of Appeals, which is considered by many scholars and many federal bureaucrats as the country's main administrative law court. The federal courts began to use what became known as the hard look doctrine, meaning that when agencies were exercising authority given by the Congress, federal courts should use or take a hard look at how that authority was being used. And this reflected, once again, the federal courts being skeptical of how agencies were using that authority. And in particular, many of the judges on the DC Circuit were concerned that federal agencies were being co-opted by those that the agencies were supposed to be regulating. But this is a story of, if you will, an oscillating pendulum, because just as quickly as the federal courts showed skepticism, in 1984, the US Supreme Court swung back the other direction. The court, in the case of Chevron versus Natural Resources Defense Council in 1984, chastised the DC Circuit. And in the process, the majority opinion by Justice Stevens created a two-part test that federal courts were supposed to use when agencies exercised discretionary authority. The first part of the test is relatively straightforward. If Congress's intent was clear in legislation, both the bureaucracy and federal courts were to follow that intent. So that was the first step of the Chevron ruling. Step two, if, however, Congress was unclear with its intent, then federal courts should defer to reasonable or permissible agency interpretation of law. And this was considered very deferential, okay, a very deferential test. Next slide, please. The Chevron ruling was widely accepted within the federal judiciary. And to give you a sense of how widely accepted it became, both liberals and conservatives on the US Supreme Court, at least initially, were very supportive of the ruling. So for instance, Justices Breyer, usually considered a liberal on the Supreme Court, and Justice Scalia, typically characterized as a conservative, both were very supportive of the court's ruling in Chevron. Bureaucrats loved the Chevron ruling because, again, has been noted historically, the United States Congress in the modern administrative state was not noted for being explicitly obvious or clear with its intentions. So this gave bureaucrats quite a bit of freedom to address new public policy problems. And Congress, for that matter, never really responded, never really corrected, if you will, the Supreme Court. There were a couple anomalous court rulings in the aftermath of Chevron. So for instance, in the FDA versus Brown-Williamson case, a narrow majority of the Supreme Court chastised the Food and Drug Administration for attempting to get around its explicit authorizing statute that prohibited the FDA from regulating tobacco products. And then there was Massachusetts versus the EPA. In Massachusetts versus the EPA, what was really noteworthy was that the Supreme Court granted standing, the opportunity to stand in front of a court and claim that one has been injured. The court granted standing to Massachusetts and agreed with Massachusetts that the Bush 43 EPA not only had the authority, but the obligation to regulate greenhouse gases. But those were the anomalies. For most of about 20 to 25 years after Chevron, the federal courts, the bureaucracy, the United States Congress, all were generally in acceptance of the Chevron ruling. Next slide, please. What led to the major questions doctrine arising on the court? Well, probably the biggest factor in the major questions doctrine being used by the Supreme Court were changes to the Supreme Court's membership. This is a pretty well-known phenomenon within the judicial politics literature. The classic example typically used by judicial politics scholars is what occurred in the 1950s and 60s in the Supreme Court in regards to civil rights. When you saw the membership of the court changed in the 1940s with appointments made by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Truman, and then Eisenhower, as the court's membership changed, the court's interpretation of significant constitutional clauses like the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause, or whether or not the Bill of Rights applied to the states. That occurred in large part because we get membership change that looked at the law, or in this particular example, the Constitution, differently. If we jump forward to this millennium, what we see in the decade of the 2010s, is the court's membership begins to change. Justices like Scalia, Kennedy, and Ginsburg, all who were very or generally supportive of the Chevron ruling, were replaced by justices, specifically Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, and Coney Barrett. And those justices came to the court with a fair amount of skepticism about the Chevron precedent. You couple those three with existing members of the court, like Chief Justice John Roberts and Associate Justices Thomas and Alito, who were well-known skeptics of Chevron. And now all of a sudden, what was a minority view on the court becomes a majority view. And this is seen pretty clearly in roughly the last year and a half. The first two cases that clued us in to the court's evolving doctrine concerning review of agency initiatives were the Alabama Association of Realtors versus Health and Human Services, and NFIB versus the Department of Labor. The first case was in 2021. The second was earlier this year. Next slide. In the realtors case, what was at issue was the Centers for Disease Control extension of the eviction moratorium. As many of you may recall, when the pandemic hit the United States, the Centers for Disease Control, first with the Trump administration, but then the Biden administration, issued an eviction moratorium as a way to help combat the spread of COVID-19. Now, initially, realtors and landlords said very little about the eviction moratorium. But eventually, when the Biden administration extended it a second time, the Association of Realtors brought a challenge claiming that the CDC did not have the authority to issue the eviction moratorium. And the 6 justices that I just mentioned, Roberts, Thomas, Alito, Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, and Coney Barrett, agreed with the association. 5 months later, another Biden administration policy initiative came in front of the court. And both of these cases are what's known as shadow docket cases, meaning these were cases that were brought to the court on appeal, and they were appeals of lower court orders. And typically with the shadow docket, the justices do not receive full written briefs and they don't hold oral arguments. It's considered the emergency docket of the court. In the NFIB versus the Department of Labor case, what was at issue was the OSHA requirement that all employers with 100 or more employees, which would have been roughly 2/3 of the private sector employment base, those employers had to compel employees to either be fully vaccinated against COVID-19 or to be tested weekly and wear masks at work. And the Supreme Court, once again, ruled against the Biden administration. In both of these cases, the court held in brief per curiam opinions that the regulations would have a significant impact on the country. And therefore, the agencies had to have clear authority from Congress to issue such regulations. And in both, the court made reference to these are major questions, and such major questions require explicit authority coming from the United States Congress. Next slide. So what was at issue in West Virginia versus EPA? The Biden administration's EPA, wanted to roll back the Trump administration's interpretation of Section 7411 of the Clean Air Act. The EPA had wanted to issue new regulations to address climate change. In particular, the regulation of energy sources to encourage new or clean energy generation. West Virginia and a number of other states claimed that Congress never gave the EPA such an authority. And 6 of the justices agreed with the challengers. Next slide. Chief Justice John Roberts wrote the majority opinion, and he relied upon the major questions doctrine. And he defined it this way: if a proposed regulation could be reasonably predicted to have a major impact on the public and or the economy, Congress needs to explicitly grant the authority to the agency to issue the regulation. Otherwise, according to Roberts, an agency would be violating a core principle of constitutional theory. Legislative power rests with the Congress, and any delegation of that power to the unelected bureaucracy must be clear and unambiguous. There were 3 dissenters in the West Virginia case. They are typically referred to by scholars as the 3 liberals. So that would have been Justices Breyer, Sotomayor, and Kagan. And all 3 said what the Biden administration wanted to do fit the purpose of the Clean Air Act. And therefore, it wasn't the function or job of the courts to second guess the experts in the EPA. According to the dissenters, it was the job of Congress to hold accountable the EPA if Congress thought the EPA went too far. Next slide. What were the reactions to West Virginia versus EPA? Some of you may have seen this in the mainstream media. It was typically labeled a conservative court was restricting a policy initiative favored by liberals. Amongst administrative law scholars, some were very critical of the Roberts Court because the analysis used by Chief Justice Roberts didn't really engage in statutory analysis. It just went ahead and said the EPA did not meet a threshold question, and therefore what the EPA wanted to do was beyond its legal authority. What administrative law scholars have agreed to is the major questions doctrine sends a rather clear message to agencies. Statutory ambiguity can no longer justify broad assertions of regulatory authority. We may not know precisely what is or is not a major question, but the court is showing increased skepticism of any presidential administration that is claiming broad authority to do X. So we've now seen more than likely the inglorious death of the Chevron precedent. And to continue my narrative, if you will, stream, the pendulum is swung back to where the federal courts are supposed to be skeptical of agency claim of broad authority to act. Next slide. And I know I'm slightly over time, so I'll quickly go through this last slide. What are the implications of the major questions doctrine? Beyond its impact on the EPA's climate change efforts, and I can touch upon this during the Q&A, the EPA still has quite a bit of authority to regulate climate change, but we can get into that during the Q&A. I think executive branch agencies should understand this. They more than likely will not receive Chevron deference, at least in the short term, perhaps even the next 5 to 10 years. Another thing that agencies should take into account, long-standing, hardly ever changed authorizing statutes. Those laws passed by Congress decades ago, which in some instances initially created agencies, might not be perceived by the federal judiciary as the basis for executive branch policy initiatives. And I think pretty clearly the United States Supreme Court is re-emphasizing separation of powers and sending a pretty clear message not only to the bureaucracy, but to Congress. And that is, if Congress, as representatives of the people, want policy change, then they're going to have to pass legislation to give the executive branch the authority to do so. Next slide. Thank you.
Professor Augie, thank you so much for that excellent presentation. We received a few questions from members of the audience who are interested more about or interested in your thoughts around sort of the authority that has been given to the EPA. So I wonder if you, after you have a chance to rest a bit, just 2 seconds and drink a cup of coffee to re-wet your throat, I wonder if we could lean in a little bit with a few questions without tiring you out, if that's okay.
Oh, that's fine.
Awesome. So in your presentation, you mentioned that the EPA already has significant authority to regulate the environment and address climate change. So could you give us a few more examples of this authority and just really use your expertise to sort of weigh in on this issue, please?
Sure. The first thing I would mention in regards to the EPA's authority to address climate change is the Supreme Court's ruling in Massachusetts versus EPA. Because in that ruling, the court clearly stated that not only did the EPA have the authority to address greenhouse gases, which are one of the leading causes of climate change, but that the EPA had the obligation. So it's one thing to go ahead and have the Supreme Court say, you have the authority, but you don't have to use it. But in Massachusetts versus EPA, the Supreme Court said, not only does the EPA have the authority, it has the obligation. Congress is expecting it to act. So that's one source of the EPA's authority to address climate change. The other thing that I would go ahead and mention is the EPA has been using a particular section of the Clean Air Act for years, and it's section 7411. And nothing in West Virginia versus EPA suggests that regulatory techniques or tools that the EPA had been using exceeded its authority in the Clean Air Act. Now, are those the kind of energy generation changes that many climate change advocates would like to see? Probably not. But in regards to the authority to use well-established regulations, the EPA still can use them. The other thing that I would go ahead and mention is, and students of mine are probably tired of hearing me say this, whether it is the Trump administration, the Biden administration, the Obama administration, some future presidential administration, if you want to move forward as an agency and do broad sweeping policy change, the safest course of action is to follow the Administrative Procedures Act. Because even this Supreme Court has acknowledged that when agencies follow the Administrative Procedures Act, the courts are less likely to second guess or to even entertain whether or not this is a major question. So if I was legal counsel for the EPA, I would say first, read and understand what the court said in Massachusetts versus EPA. That's one. Two, what have we done in the past that has proven to be effective that cannot be challenged by various states, industry groups, etc., because those practices have already received approval from the federal courts. And then second or third, follow the Administrative Procedures Act. I know it slows things down, but most public administration studies have shown that following the APA, the Administrative Procedures Act, takes 12 to 18 months. 12 to 18 months. Forcing an agency to go through informal rulemaking, I know Again, if you're an agency, you want to get things done, you got this expertise already on staff. But, that's like due process, right? It's, you don't always get the outcome you want, but at least the process, okay, you can point to the process and say, we gave individuals an opportunity to respond. So.
Thank you so much. Along those lines, I see we have a few more questions coming in.
Okay.
Besides climate change, what other policy areas might be impacted in the near future as a result of this shift?
That's a really good question. One that comes to mind, and one that a number of people have asked me about, is the Biden administration's loan forgiveness program. And there are actually two questions that I think the federal courts will have to address. First of all, will any challenges to the loan forgiveness program, will any of the challengers have standing? And that's a basic threshold question that federal courts ask. And for those of you who've never heard that concept before, basically all standing means is you can stand in front of a federal court, claim an injury, show that your injury has been caused by the government, and that the court can redress that injury. So let's say, for instance, there's some challenger who can satisfy standing. The next question, and this is where I think the major questions doctrine might get used, is what's the statutory authority that the Biden administration is drawing upon with the loan forgiveness program? Now, the Department of Justice has issued a number of memorandums suggesting the HEROES Act. For those of you who don't know, the HEROES Act was passed after the 9/11 attacks and was designed to go ahead and provide a benefit for those first responders and American service women and men who were responding to terrorism. And the idea was, and there's a clause in the HEROES Act that allows the executive branch to forego student loan payments for individuals helping the nation respond to the 9/11 attacks. But there's also language there about an emergency. So is COVID-19 still an emergency? Right? And this is where I think the major questions doctrine might prove to be troublesome for the Biden administration, because the law was passed in response to one crisis or emergency. And unfortunately, President Biden stated during an infamous 60 Minutes interview that COVID-19 was, and please forgive me if I don't get the exact words correct, but basically over. So if COVID-19 is over, is it still an emergency? And was that what Congress intended when it passed the HEROES Act? So that's just one example of how the major questions doctrine can hamstring, or could hamstring, a presidential administration who wants to enact bold policy initiatives. I mean, and I get this. I imagine some of you are thinking, well, presidents can't go to Congress because the Congress is dysfunctional. I grant you that point. Okay, I will acknowledge that as a particular fact. But what the Supreme Court is saying is, if you're going to enact different or broad policy change, you're probably going to have to get some buy-in or some support or authority from Congress.
I see. I just dropped in I'll drop in the link, the chat, some more information around the HEROES Act, particularly as it is aligned to the COVID-19 crisis. But I want to pivot a little bit, if you don't mind, because we have quite a few questions that are dropping in. So I want to make sure we get to those questions. So one of our participants are asking the question, are you saying that going forward, federal bureaucracies might lose authority that they have been using for years or decades? Could you clarify that point, Professor Augie?
I'm not saying that agencies will lose authority that they have been using, in some cases, for multiple decades. What I am saying is they won't be able to use that authority in new, novel ways going forward. All right. I almost get the sense that at least one or two of the justices in the majority would prefer incremental change to come from the bureaucracy. And again, I understand many presidents want to enact, major reforms because they, ran for office claiming that when I get into office, I'm going to do X and it's going to be this great change. But at least what the major questions doctrine is seemingly saying, unless you can go ahead and tie it to what you have been currently doing, right? We're going to force you to get authority from Congress. All right. Is that I think I answered that question.
I think you did.
Yeah,
and
okay.
it gives us some insight on both the will and the way. So I wonder if you could take a second or two and respond to this next question. I'll just read it as is. So the majority on the court maintain that Congress needs to give clear direction on how to carry out a federal agency action, where the dissenters claim that Congress should only be involved in curtailing federal agency actions when they think they have gone too far. What would be your response to that?
Well, historically, Congress has not done a very good job with accountability or holding the executive branch accountable. And scholars know this. Whether you're a scholar of the United States Congress or a public policy scholar, this idea that Congress will have the will to hold the bureaucracy accountable, that's not happened all that often. And when Congress has attempted to come up with new tools or techniques for that kind of accountability of the executive branch, occasionally the Supreme Court has even held those tools unconstitutional. And what I'm talking about there, Dean Barry James, is the Supreme Court declaring the legislative veto unconstitutional in 1983. So this does kind of sort of strike me as the court majority presenting a kind of Hobson's choice to the United States Congress. And the Hobson's choice is this: if you're the Congress, the court seems to be saying to you, if we want to address something like climate change, which we never considered when we passed the Clean Air Act, let's be clear, right? That was not on the agenda. That was not a quote unquote public policy problem when the Clean Air Act was originally passed, okay? The court seems to be saying to Congress, you're going to have to write detailed legislation to give the EPA the authority to tackle this problem. But those of us who study politics know the more detailed the legislation, the greater the likelihood it will not pass. Or, and here's the other side of the Hobson's choice, pass vague legislation, give broad authority to the bureaucracy, and hope the federal courts don't declare the use of that authority illegal. I'm a little bit of a cynic, but I think that's a terrible choice for the United States Supreme Court to be giving the United States Congress. Because I understand what the majority on the court seemingly is saying with the major questions doctrine. You know, we have separation of powers in the Constitution for a reason. Okay, fine. That's great theoretically. But in practice, in 21st century America, what's the likelihood the United States Congress is going to come to an agreement on how to address something like climate change?
Well, you offer a very important insight. I do want to weigh in here, though. We have in the chat a question from Professor J. Albanese. He's with the Wilder School. And so I want to ask his question for you. We have a couple questions, but I'll get to them. But we have some time. So Professor J. Albanese is saying, if SCOTUS is sending authority back to Congress, it does not appear that Congress is interested or able to legislate on substantive issues given political division. They have trouble passing a budget, ! Will this not result in Congress looking even more to the corporate sector to write more detailed legislation, taking over for administrative regulations, thereby further undoing regulations on business and industry? And it certainly is an important question. I'm glad that Professor Albanese has asked this question. We would love to hear your insight on this.
I think the danger that Dr. Albanese, his question gets at is a danger in regards to the Congress either relying more upon business and industry, or relying upon interest groups, okay, to basically draft the legislation and then provide, if you will, campaign fundraising to make sure that the legislation gets approved in future sessions of Congress. Either way, we have an accountability issue, because neither business or industry nor interest groups are accountable to the people. So we know this for years, for decades, that a lot of the legislation proposed and even approved by the United States Congress is not necessarily written by members of Congress. A lot of it gets written by staffers hired by members of Congress, but a lot of it is written by those who would be regulated by the legislation. And that's been a problem in not only the American form of democracy, but most Western advanced democracies for decades. On the other hand, do we go ahead and exclude those groups, whether business and industry or interest groups, from participating in the political process? That's a tough one to answer, right? But I can see Dr. Albanese's point. Now, there are some climate change advocates who argue that perhaps we would get more effective climate change policies if we stopped relying on the federal bureaucracy and actually had the United States Congress work with both business/industry, but also environmental groups. That instead of relying upon the experts in the EPA to solve all of our problems, we should actually have the Congress work with both groups who would be directly impacted by any kind of climate change legislation. Now, I don't know if that's as pie in the sky as some of the other alternatives or not, but if you want to get buy-in from business and industry, and you want to get buy-in from environmental groups, perhaps having the locus of policy making in the EPA it might be wise to go ahead and shift that focus. Just a thought.
Sure.
Yeah.
I hear that. I wonder if we have a few more questions and we have some time. 10 minutes is a lot of time. I'm just thinking that there are two really important issues that are percolating from our conversation today. One is around the shift, and the other is around accountability. And so I have two questions. I'm going to try and combine them a little bit regarding federal agencies' accountability to the people. And another one of our participants says, do you think there's going to be some significant impact or curtail of federal agencies and their ability to carry out their agenda, some of which is easily published and readily available to the American public, or will the impact, or will this only impact the most controversial actions? So this participant imagines that it'll be relatively easy to find standing in even minor agency programs. And so I wonder what you think about accountability and the shift.
Both of those issues, you went ahead and mentioned, we have 10 minutes. I could go ahead and talk about both all afternoon if you guys let me. Okay, so let's go back to the first part. This idea or question about, will the major questions doctrine be applied to most agency regulations, right? I mean, because there is an accountability issue. Dean Barry James, you've talked about one of the most significant theoretical questions in public administration and policy since the rise of the administrative state, which is, how do you hold the experts accountable, right? Because social contract theory would suggest that the public can hold those in the government who make decisions on their behalf accountable. But we don't hold elections for civil servants in the EPA, the IRS, the CDC, pick the agency, right? We don't hold elections. So who's going to hold them accountable? We already talked about how the Congress typically doesn't provide much meaningful oversight of the executive branch, right? So are we now going to go ahead and rely upon another unelected branch of government to hold? I mean, let's face it, the federal judiciary is unelected, okay? So are we going to rely upon them to hold the bureaucracy accountable? That would be a really odd democratic theory phenomenon, right? I mean, that is one of the purposes of judicial review, but that's just, it strikes me as strange or odd in a democracy if we have one unelected branch of the government holding another unelected unit of another branch of the government accountable, because otherwise we have no tool or technique to do so. Okay, so there's that. The second part of your question, and please refresh my memory. The second part of your question was?
The second part of the question was, and I think you really did get to that, was really about, sort of the impact of this kind of review and really leaning into understanding, at what point do we sort of weigh in or lean in, right? Making sure that, do we lean in on issues that are the most controversial, that impacts the most people? Do we lean in on even the minor agency programs or initiatives that are considered controversial? So,
yeah, and there, a question that comes to my mind, Dean, is this: who's going to go ahead and define a major or a minor program? Right? I mean, we know this in teaching and studying public policy, that even the smallest of federal government programs can have a huge impact on somebody's life. So are we going to go ahead and say, because it's the EPA and we're talking about billions of dollars of changing energy generation, yeah, we're going to apply the major questions to that kind of initiative, or the student loan forgiveness program, okay, that the Congressional Budget Office has tabulated as being potentially costing somewhere around what, $600 million? Okay. Are we only going to focus on those efforts, or are we going to go ahead and focus on a federal housing program that makes sure that Americans actually have shelter? Or a student lunch or breakfast program that comparatively don't cost as much, but in terms of the impact on the individuals is rather significant. Yeah, these these are the difficult questions that arise when the Supreme Court changes its review precedent of federal agencies. Because I have a couple of friends who work in the federal government, and they ask me, okay, so Augie, what would you advise our agency to do to make sure we comply with West Virginia versus EPA? And I said two things: pull out your authorizing legislation and see if you can root what you want to do in that. And two, dust off the Administrative Procedures Act and make sure that you're following notice and comment rulemaking. And both of them were just like, really? We have to go back to that? I'm like, I don't know what else to tell you. Because if you read West Virginia versus EPA, the Supreme Court is saying, okay, any policy initiative that could have a major significant impact on the economy, on the public, the agency must have clear authority from Congress. Wow.
Well,
Okay.
you know, Professor Augie, I just want to lean in here for a minute. I am actually at the NASPA 2022 conference in Chicago currently. The conference the president is Dean Susan Gooden, who's dean at the Wilder School. She's currently president of the NASPA 2022 conference. And her theme is a bold and noble public service for all. And so I think that, among other things, that, you know, it is clear that leadership matters. And so I wonder if you could, in the few minutes that we have left, and we really have like a minute or two left, I wonder if you could talk about how leadership matters, particularly as we think through the major questions that are in front of us.
Leadership in the start of the third decade of the 21st century, at least in my mind, what I would describe is leaders who understand that if you want bold change, relying upon political parties and ideology is not going to get you that change. There are too many groups and too many institutions that say no or point out the flaws. So how do you go ahead and bridge those groups or reach those groups who would normally go ahead and say, I'm not going to work with you because you're a Democratic president, or I'm not going to work with you because you're part of a party that supported former President Trump. I'm not going to work with you because the Supreme Court said you can't. Okay, well, the Supreme Court said you can't in one regard, but what can you do? So instead of looking for no and looking for why avenues might be closed, look for those opportunities to where you can actually go ahead and work with other people. Even for instance, some who might not necessarily agree with your policy positions. That's what I would like to go ahead and see. Because when I read West Virginia versus EPA, I first read it as an administrative law scholar, but then I went ahead and read it as a citizen. And that's where I went ahead and focused on, well, what can the EPA still do in regards to climate change? So instead of focusing on the negative, I focused on the opportunities. And
Thank
if
you,
some,
Professor Aughenbaugh.
yeah, and if somebody at the EPA said, okay, what should we do going forward? I'll be like, okay, so what have you done in the past that has worked? How can you make incremental change that will get buy-in from those groups that typically go ahead and say no? And again, I know that might be a little, optimistic, but, that's where I fall down on this. Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you both for a great conversation, and thank you to our communications team behind the scenes working with us. Please save the date for our next Lunch and Learn on November 16th with our speaker, Dr. Calvin Johnson from the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. We're really excited for this conversation. And we look forward to everyone joining us then. Again, thank you to our moderator, Dr. RaJade James. Thank you to Dr. John Aughenbaugh for another great conversation. We really enjoyed it. Thank you so much, everyone, and have a great afternoon.